Somewhere in a barn in Oklahoma right now, there's a 1979 Kenworth W900 with a train horn bolted to it, a turned-up Cummins, and 2 logbooks in the glove box. 50 years ago, that truck was the smartest machine on the interstate because the driver who built it solved problems the factory never could. But almost every trick, invention, and workaround those old-school drivers came up with is now illegal. Some carry fines north of $25,000. And the story of how each one got banned tells you exactly what happened to American trucking. Now, before anybody gets upset, let's be clear about something. These weren't criminals. These were working men in an era when the truck was your office, your bedroom, and your business, and nobody was coming to help you. If the factory didn't build it, you built it yourself. If the rule didn't make sense, you found a way around it. That was the culture. And honestly, a lot of the equipment on modern trucks exists because some driver in a gravel lot invented the crude version first. So today, we're counting down 12 of those pure genius ideas, from the loudest to the one that finally broke the government's patience. And number 1 is the invention regulators feared so much they wrote a rule specifically to kill it. Number 12, the locomotive train horn. Old-school drivers had a problem the factory air horn couldn't fix. Four-wheelers simply did not respect a truck horn. They'd cut off 80,000 pounds of loaded Peterbilt like it was a Buick. So drivers started visiting railroad salvage yards, buying actual locomotive horns, the big Nathan and Leslie 5-chime units off retired diesel engines, and plumbing them into the truck's air system. The result was a sound that didn't ask cars to move. It commanded them. A real train horn hit somewhere around 150 decibels, loud enough to rattle windows a quarter mile away, and drivers swore it prevented more accidents than any safety device Detroit ever invented. There are stories of half-asleep drivers drifting into a truck's lane on Interstate 40 and getting snapped awake so hard they nearly climbed into the back seat. But the noise complaints piled up, towns wrote ordinances, and today, most states treat an unauthorized train horn on a road vehicle as an illegal equipment violation, with citations, forced removal, and fines that stack up fast for repeat offenders. The genius solution to being ignored got legislated into silence. And speaking of noise, the next one is a sound every driver over 60 can still hear in his sleep. Number 11. Straight pipes and the open Jake brake. The Jacobs engine brake changed mountain driving forever. Before the Jake, coming down Cabbage Hill or the Grapevine meant riding your service brakes and praying they didn't fade. The Jake let the engine itself slow the truck. Pure genius. And it saved lives. Full stop. But old school drivers took it a step further. They pulled the mufflers and ran straight pipes, partly for a little extra performance, partly because a big cat or Cummins barking through open stacks on a 6% downgrade sounded like the voice of God. That machine gun rattle echoing off a canyon wall was the soundtrack of the American West. Then the subdivisions started creeping toward the highways, and the people in those subdivisions did not appreciate the concert at 2 in the morning. Towns across the country posted those famous signs, "Engine brake prohibited," and started writing tickets. Combine an unmuffled exhaust with an open Jake inside city limits today, and you're collecting noise violations, equipment violations, and in some jurisdictions, the fines climb into 4 figures per stop. The sound of safety became the sound of a citation. But at least the Jake slowed you down. This next trick did the opposite. Number 10. Turning up the pump. Modern drivers live with computer-controlled engines, locked down tighter than a bank vault. Old-school drivers lived in a different world. A mechanical Cummins Big Cam or a Caterpillar 3406 was an honest machine, and a driver with a screwdriver, a dial indicator, and an afternoon could turn up the fuel pump and wake up horsepower the factory never advertised. A 350 Cummins could become a 400 plus, with fuel pressure adjustments, different injectors, maybe a turbo swap done in a dirt lot on a Sunday. Drivers called it letting the engine breathe. Owner-operators pulling heavy loads over the Rockies considered it basic survival. because the difference between 300 and 450 horses was the difference between 30 miles an hour and 50 on a long grade. The problem came when regulators connected hot engines to smoke, speed, and eventually emissions. Governor tampering and speed limiter violations became citable offenses. And once electronic engines arrived in the 90s, unauthorized ECM tuning became tampering in the eyes of the law, with penalties that today reach thousands of dollars per violation. The shade tree horsepower era ended with a password screen. Of course, more power meant more weight you could pull. And more weight brings us to the most famous cat and mouse game in trucking history. Number 9. The chicken coop dodge. Every old driver knows the coops, the weigh stations, and every old driver knows that the coops close, that the scale men go home, and that certain state routes run parallel to the interstate with no scale on them at all. Old school drivers built an entire unwritten atlas of bypass routes, passed driver to driver over the CB and truck stop coffee. Running heavy out of a grain elevator in Kansas, there was a farm road for that. Overloaded coming out of a paper mill in Georgia, somebody's cousin knew a route. It was genius in the purest sense, a crowdsourced navigation system decades before GPS existed, maintained entirely by memory and radio chatter. The states fought back with portable scales, roving DOT officers sitting on those exact bypass routes, and eventually electronic screening that reads your truck before you ever see the scale house. Get caught heavy today, and the fines run per pound over the limit, which on a badly overloaded truck can mean thousands of dollars in a single stop, plus points, plus the load sitting until you shed weight. The secret map still exists in the memories of retired drivers, but the game itself is mostly over, and fuel was its own game entirely. Number 8. The auxiliary tank and the great fuel tax hunt. Before the fuel tax system got unified, every state charged its own rate, and the differences were serious money. So old-school owner-operators did the math and got creative. They mounted extra fuel tanks, sometimes hundreds of gallons of additional capacity, and filled everything to the brim in the cheap states. A driver could cross 3 or 4 expensive states without buying a single gallon. Some ran the numbers so precisely they'd coast into a cheap fuel state with fumes in the tank, grinning the whole way. It was completely rational, a small businessman shopping for his biggest expense, and the states absolutely hated it because fuel tax was supposed to pay for the roads the truck was wearing out. The answer was IFTA, the International Fuel Tax Agreement, which made drivers track and report miles per state, so the tax followed the road use no matter where the fuel was purchased. Suddenly, the extra tanks bought nothing, and sloppy paperwork brought audits, back taxes, penalties, and interest that could bury a one-truck operation. The loophole didn't just close, it turned into a filing requirement. But taxes were a slow enemy. The next 2 items were about the fast one. Number 7. The Fuzz Buster. Speed limits in the double nickel era felt like an insult. 55 miles an hour nationwide, on trucks built to cruise at 70, hauling freight that paid by the mile. So drivers adopted a piece of electronic genius, the radar detector, the Fuzzbuster, mounted right on the dash next to the CB. The detector heard the Smokey's radar before the Smokey saw you, and for about 20 years it was standard equipment in half the trucks in America. Paired with the CB network calling out bear reports, a driver rolling across Nebraska had better intelligence on law enforcement than law enforcement had on him. Then in 1994, the federal government banned radar detectors in commercial vehicles outright, one of the only nationwide bans of its kind. And today, a detector on the dash of a truck means a violation on your record and a fine, with the device confiscated. Four-wheelers in most states can still run one legally. Truck drivers can't. The men who invented the culture around the technology are the only ones forbidden to use it. And that CB network we just mentioned, that got its own crackdown. If you lived through this era, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because we dig into the golden age of trucking every week. The trucks, the drivers, and the stories the industry forgot. Now, back to the radio. Number 6. The boots. A stock CB radio was legally limited to 4 watts of power, good for a few miles on flat ground. Old school drivers found that laughable, so they installed linear amplifiers, boots, kickers, whatever you called them in your part of the country, boosting that 4 watts into hundreds, sometimes thousands. A driver with a good amp and a tuned antenna in the Texas Panhandle could talk skip to a driver in Ohio. During the 70s, the CB was the internet of the highway, and the amp boys were its power users, running weather, wrecks, bear reports, and pure entertainment across half the continent. The trouble was that a 2,000-watt amplifier doesn't stay politely inside channel 19. It bleeds across the band, stomps on other users, interferes with televisions and emergency frequencies, and the FCC treats unlicensed high-power transmission as a serious offense. Enforcement actions against illegal amplifier operators have carried forfeitures reaching $10,000 and $20,000 and beyond, some of the steepest penalties on this entire list. The most connected drivers in America were, technically, running illegal radio stations from their bunks, which is a good place to mention that fuel wasn't always bought legally either. Number 5. The red fuel. Farm diesel and road diesel are the same fuel with one difference: red dye and a tax. Dyed diesel is sold untaxed for off-road use, tractors, generators, equipment. And plenty of old-school drivers who grew up on farms knew exactly where the untaxed fuel lived. When freight rates got thin, some of them ran red fuel in the truck, saving the road tax on every gallon, and betting nobody would ever look. For years, nobody did. Then the government started dipping tanks, literally sending officers to draw fuel samples at scales and roadside checks, and the dye made the crime self-documenting. One glance at a pink sample and the case was closed. The IRS penalty runs $1,000 minimum, or $10 a gallon, whichever is greater, per violation. On a truck holding 300 gallons, do that math, and understand why a couple of dip tanks could exceed the value of the truck. The cheapest fuel on the list turned out to be the most expensive. But the boldest fuel-saving trick of all didn't involve fuel at all. It involved gravity. Number 4. The Georgia Overdrive. This one is legend. Pull the transmission into neutral at the top of a long grade and let gravity do what diesel costs money to do. Drivers called it the Georgia Overdrive, or Mexican Overdrive depending on where you learned it. And on the right hill, a heavy truck coasting free could sail past every governed truck on the road while burning nothing. Old hands bragged about coasting 10-12 miles without touching the throttle, watching the fuel needle hold perfectly still. As a piece of pure economics, it was brilliant. As a piece of physics, it was terrifying. Because a truck in neutral has no engine braking, no jake, nothing between the driver and runaway except service brakes that heat up and fade. Enough trucks ended up in runaway ramps, and worse, that lawmakers made coasting in neutral downhill explicitly illegal for commercial vehicles. And today, it's the kind of violation that puts a CDL holder out of service on the spot and can end a career. The old-timers will tell you they knew which hills could be coasted and which couldn't, and the honest ones will admit they got it wrong sometimes too. Now, the top 3. These aren't just tricks anymore. These are the 3 ideas that defined old-school trucking, and killing them took acts of the federal government. Number 3. The comic book. Paper logbooks ran this industry for 80 years, and old-school drivers turned them into an art form. The official book showed a driver perfectly legal, 10 hours driving, proper brakes, everything squared away in neat pencil. The second book, the comic book, the swindle sheet, told the truth. Some drivers ran 2 complete logbooks. Others mastered creative arithmetic in a single book, logging a 500-mile day as 8 hours of driving through the magic of optimistic average speeds. Was it legal? No. Was it universal? Ask any driver who worked the 70s and 80s, and watch him smile. The economics of the industry practically demanded it, because freight paid by the mile and the clock paid nothing. Inspectors knew, drivers knew the inspectors knew, and the whole system ran on a wink. Then came the electronic logging device mandate in December of 2017, and the wink died overnight. The ELD watches the truck itself, not the pencil, and falsifying records today brings federal civil penalties that can run past $10,000 per violation, on top of out-of-service orders and a wrecked safety score. Millions of miles of American freight moved on comic books. The government needed a computer bolted to the engine to finally stop it. But drivers had one more move left, and it was under the hood. Number 2. Deleting the new diesel. When emissions equipment arrived on diesel engines, the exhaust gas recirculation, the particulate filters, the DEF systems, old-school drivers looked at it the way a carpenter looks at a hammer made of glass. The early systems choked power, burned extra fuel, and broke down in ways that stranded trucks and cost 5-figure repair bills. So the old solution reappeared. Fix it yourself. A whole underground industry grew up around deleting the equipment, removing the DPF, tuning out the sensors, and running the engine the way engines used to run, simple and strong. Drivers who did it reported better mileage, more power, and no more limp mode breakdowns on the side of the interstate. From a pure mechanic standpoint, it worked. From the government standpoint, it was tampering with the Clean Air Act, and the hammer came down hard. The EPA has pursued shops and fleets with civil penalties running into the tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Individual tampering violations carry fines that can reach 5 figures per truck, and states like California added their own layer of enforcement on top. The last great act of shade tree independence became one of the most expensive violations in the industry, which brings us to number 1. The idea so good, the government wrote a rule just to make it stop existing. Number 1. The glider kit. This was the masterpiece. A glider kit was a brand new truck, new frame, new cab, new everything, sold without an engine and transmission. Old school drivers and small builders would drop in a rebuilt pre-emissions engine, a mechanical Detroit, or an older Cat or Cummins from before the emissions era. And the result was the perfect machine. New truck reliability, old engine simplicity, better fuel mileage than the new emission engines, no DEF, no regens, no computer nannies, and a price tens of thousands below a new truck. It was everything the old school driver believed in, bolted together and titled. By the mid-2010s, glider production was booming, thousands of them rolling out every year, and for a moment, it looked like the golden age had found a legal loophole back into existence. That's exactly why it died. The EPA moved to cap glider production at 300 units per builder per year, starting in 2018, arguing the old engines emitted many times the pollution of new ones, and the cap strangled the industry almost overnight. The big glider builders collapsed or pivoted, and the last legal path to a brand new old-school truck closed for good. Nobody banned the idea because it failed. They banned it because it worked. So look at what this list actually is. 12 times, a working driver saw a problem, solved it with his own hands and his own wits, and 12 times the answer from above was a rule book and a fine. Some of those rules genuinely saved lives, and an honest old hand will admit the Georgia Overdrive and the comic book had bodies attached to them. But some of those rules just made the job smaller. The train horns, the boots, the turned-up Cummins, the glider kits, those were the fingerprints of men who treated trucking as a craft, not a data stream. Today's driver sits in a truck that watches him, logs him, governs him, and reports him, and he's arguably safer for it. But something got traded away, and every driver over 60 knows exactly what it was. The old-school driver wasn't breaking the system. He built the system one workaround at a time, and the industry spent 50 years catching up to ideas born in gravel lots and truck stop counters. If you ran any of these back in the day, the comment section is yours, and nobody here is judging. Tell us which one you ran and which one you miss. And if you want more from the golden age, watch our video on the truck stop culture that vanished forever, because the trucks weren't the only thing they took. Thanks for riding along, and keep the shiny side up.